I am Jamie Cowan, Rabbi of Tikvat Israel congregation in Richmond, Virginia, and a teacher of Jewish history. I've taught the Jewish history course around the world in many of your classes, the MJBI classes, and now I'm happy to bring it to you by DVD. Maybe some of my former students are seeing me here on DVD. Sorry to say my hair is a little whiter than it was the last time you saw me, but anyway, that's as it is. But anyway, this is the third kind of course of Jewish history, and we're actually going to pick up with really one of the most significant events in all of world history right here, known as the Zionist movement, which is the return of the Jewish people back to the land of Israel. But I want to begin with this thought that as we come into the 20th century, which is where ultimately where the Zionist movement takes place, we actually face two countervailing forces, that one by the Lord, one by the devil, that is trying to deal with a final blow to the Jews. The one by the Lord is a fulfillment of prophecy to bring the Jewish people back to the promised land, as he prophesied hundreds of years ago, and we're going to see that in just a minute as we look at some scriptures. And then the other force is, as they're coming back to the promised land, the devil has the plan to kill them through the rise of Nazism and the Holocaust. So you have these two forces operating at the same time, and of course in the end we know while there was a tremendous loss of life in the Holocaust period, the Jewish people did survive, and now they are prevailing over, Israel is prevailing over the rest of the world, and God's purposes and agenda are being accomplished in the world in the day that we live, thank the Lord. So with that, I want to begin with looking at Isaiah chapter 49. Now Isaiah 49 is a passage in Isaiah that talks about, first, it talks about the coming of the Messiah and how one of the roles of the Messiah is to bring the light of God, the light of the Lord to the nations through the Jewish people. So the Messiah will empower the Jewish people to ultimately bring the light to the nations and bring salvation to the ends of the earth. But at the latter part of Isaiah, it talks about something a little bit different. And so let's pick up where Isaiah starts here, and we're going to look in Isaiah 49, picking up in, verse 22. This is what it says. This is what the sovereign Lord says. See, I will beckon to the Gentiles. I will lift up my banner to the peoples. They will bring your sons in their arms and carry your daughters on their shoulders. Kings will be your foster fathers, and their queens your nursing mothers. They will bow down before you with their faces to the ground. They will lick the dust at your feet. They will know that I am the Lord, and those who hope in me will not be disappointed. And so basically what the prophet is saying here is that at the end, the nations will come and gather the Jewish people back and bring them back to the promised land. So it's kind of a little bit of a reversal. The Lord uses the Jews to become a light to the nations, but then they get dispersed to the nations, and then the Lord uses the nations to bring the Jewish people back into the promised land. The problem is, though, as we know from this course, the previous courses that I've taught here on Jewish history, is that the reality is that the Christian church, which is really the righteous of the nations, the ones who would supposed to be following the things of the Lord, really never did that. They never really helped the Jewish people come back to the land. In fact, they did everything that they could to prevent that, to destroy the Jewish people, and so on and so forth. But that doesn't mean that God's purposes are null and void. Rather, the Lord just looks for people who are going to cooperate with him. And so we come into the 16th century, the 1500s, in England, and we see the beginning of this amazing change, because before the Jews can actually go back, there has to be raised up a nation to bring them back. In other words, God has to first do this first before the Jews can actually go back to the land. And so what I call this whole section the untold story of Christian Zionism. And I'm sure you're going to be blessed by it as we go through this. Well, the story starts with King Henry VIII, who lived in the 1500s in England, and he got tired of his wife, as we all know, and he seeks a divorce. Well, of course, he was a member of the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church would not fathom such a thing. So he removes himself from the Catholic Church, establishes his own church called the Anglican Church, and then he conveniently divorces his wife, and marries another person and then dumps them, and he's a real disaster. But God uses even our foibles for his purposes. And so because Henry pulled the English out of the Catholic Church and they had their own, it enabled an opportunity for religious freedom in the country. And the group that really takes this to task are the Puritans. Now, the Puritans were part of the early reformers from the Protestant Reformation. They were originally started in Holland, and then they migrated over to England sometime in the 1500s. And this is what was interesting about the Puritans. The Puritans are known for a lot of things, for being kind of pietists and being rigid. But the Puritans were known for a lot of good things. These were very godly people. Number one was that they were known for they wanted to build a government that would be fashioned after a government in the Scriptures. In other words, and so they searched the Scriptures for kind of the example government, an ideal government, and what they found was the government of Israel, the establishment, the Torah, and the establishment of ancient Israel, and so on. And so as they were studying the Hebrew Scriptures, which most Christians did not do until the Puritans, they discovered the prophecies about the return of the Jewish people back to the land of Israel. The other thing that the Puritans were known for was that they were known for being experts in the return of the Lord. In other words, they focused on the end times, the return of the Lord, and then they put these ideas together that the Jewish people returning to the land of Israel predates the return of the Lord. So in other words, the two have to come together for the Jews to go back, and then the Jews to come to the Lord, and then for the Lord to actually return. So in the 1580s, the Puritans began to write a series of treatises about this idea that God has called the Jewish people to be a separate nation, and God has plans to restore the Jewish people back to the land of Israel. This was like earth-shattering. Nothing like this had ever been written in Christendom. So this is brand new material, and it goes out from the Puritans around the Christian countries. From the 1620s to the 1640s, more treatises are written by the Puritans about the ultimate salvation of the Jewish people, the returning to the land, and so on and so forth. And that's what later influences Oliver Cromwell, which we covered in our last course, where the rabbi from Holland discovers the Puritans are now in control of England, and so he contacts them and persuades them to allow the Jews into England, and that lays the foundation for the return of the Jewish people back to the land of Israel. So this is all happening at this particular time. Now, the next thing to happen is that these writings of the Puritans begin to influence others in English society, including some of the great intellectuals and philosophers and scientists of English society. So we begin with John Milton in 1671. He wrote in Paradise Regained that Israel is to be restored, and that was part of God's end-time plan. John Locke, the great political philosopher of England, also supported the same idea. Sir Isaac Newton, in the year 1733, the brilliant British scientist, using a prophecy from the book of Daniel, determined that God wanted to use another nation to assist the Jewish people back into the land of Israel. That's what we started this course with here, with reading from Isaiah, that God wants to use another nation to bring the Jewish people back, and Sir Isaac Newton found the same thing in a different text of the Scriptures. Then what happens next is Napoleon invades Egypt, and let's see if we can find a map here that will show this a little bit. That's not going to do it, nor that, and I have to go back a little bit to find, here's Napoleon, but it doesn't show the area of the world we want to show. Wait a minute, that one might have, let's take a look here further back. Well, got a lot of maps here going. Here it goes, okay. This is much earlier, but it shows the map that I wanted to show. Okay, Napoleon, who had, by the early 1700s, late 1700s, had conquered, 1790s had conquered much of Europe, then aims for Egypt and the Ottoman Empire. And he invades Egypt in 1798 down here, which was controlled by the Ottomans, and then in 1799 invades Palestine. And interestingly, proclaims Palestine to be the rightful heirs to the Jews. Now, it's shocking. Napoleon was not a believer. In fact, he was an atheist. But he kind of saw this vision. But the problem was that, he was not really a godly man. And when we look at the Scriptures, we're looking at the way the Scriptures kind of outline it. It seems to be God wants to use the nations that he believes in. So there's an interesting response to Napoleon by a couple of British theologian scientists. The first one is this. This is in 1799. This is the year that Napoleon has invaded Palestine. He says this in a book that he addresses to the Jews. He says, look, the land of Palestine is uncultivated and ready to receive you, but the Turks control it. Their power must first fall. I earnestly pray for its dissolution, but it may not happen for some time. Now, what's interesting about this idea is, notice what the man says, I earnestly pray for its dissolution. In other words, what this man is seeing is that first prayer must precede action. So he's praying that God's will would be accomplished by throwing the Turks out of this land and then ultimately bringing the Jews back. And then he kind of prophesies that this may not happen for some time. He hit it right on the nose. Then the next guy who comes along is a man by the name of Thomas Witherby. And he writes in a book which he calls The Restoration of the Jews, the Crisis of All Nations. Restoration of the Jews, the Crisis of All Nations. And he says the Jews need to reject their alliance with ungodly France, because remember, Napoleon had conquered this area, and rather, he said that England will be the new Cyrus. It will be God's instrument to bring the Jews back to the promised land. Wow, what a shocker. I mean, the new Cyrus. Remember Cyrus? We started the first course on Jewish history. We talked about Cyrus from the book of Isaiah, how the prophet Isaiah calls him the Messiah, the anointed one who brings the Jews out of exile and back to the promised land. Now, this scientist, 2,500 years later, whatever, captures this vision, says that England is going to have to be used as the same tool to bring the Jewish people back, and they need to reject their alliances with ungodly France and let the British Christians be the ones to do it. Again, remarkable statement. Then in 1807, there was the establishment of the London Society for Promoting Christianity Among the Jews. This was a big mission society, but their goal was twofold. One, it was to win the Jewish people to the Lord, but then secondly, it was to bring them back to the land of Israel. Very interesting ideas here that these individuals come up with. Then in 1838, the British establish a consulate in Jerusalem. It's the first diplomatic appointment in the land of Palestine, and they do it for a reason. The goal is even though, now notice on this map, again, this is much earlier than the period that we're looking in, but the way the nation states line up, it's still similar. Palestine is part of the Ottoman Empire. It's right in the center, actually. Jerusalem is a backwater city. Very few people that live there. Not much is really happening there. The British established this consulate right there in Jerusalem where nothing's happening, and they were pushed to do so by a British Christian to establish a presence in the land to bring about the Jews, to help them to return to the promised land. That's the whole reason that they did such a thing. So it's the first British placement in the land of Palestine in the modern era, or of all time for that matter. Then the next thing that happens is very, very interesting. Remember, we've talked about the idea of the righteous remnant. 1841, the Anglican Church establishes a bishop in Jerusalem. Remember, and the person that they place as the bishop is a man by the name of Michael Solomon Alexander. He is a Jewish Christian. He becomes the bishop. He's the first Jewish bishop of Jerusalem since 133 of the Common Era. Because what was happening here is God needed to have his righteous remnant, the Messianic Jew, in the land of Israel before any of the Jews go back, because God always needs to use the righteous remnant first to bring blessing upon the entire community. And here's the first example of it in this particular time. Next thing that happens is in the 1840s in England, two major novels appear that become influential to the British public. The first one is called Judah's Lion. It's about a young man by the name of Nathan Cohen. He was an English Jew. He goes to Israel. He's transformed. He becomes a believer. And his goal is to blend Judaism and Christianity in the Promised Land. Wow. Again, amazing statements, amazing insight that these people have. And this is before any Jews had gone back. There were a handful of Jews from the prior centuries, but we're talking about a few thousand at best, maybe somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 Jews in the entire land of Palestine. So none have been going back, but this is what these British Christians were capturing. Then we have Benjamin Disraeli. We've already talked about Disraeli. This is before he becomes the prime minister. He's in the parliament, though. He writes a new book called The New Crusade. Not a great book, but whatever. Not a great title. But anyway, the idea is to blend the East and the West into Israel, and he fashions a series of political possibilities to be able to bring about this change. So Disraeli is looking at this more from a political kind of geostrategic orientation, whereas some of these other books were looking at it from a more religious orientation. Then the next event is the very interesting event, which is the Crimean War, and we can use this particular map to look at the Crimean War. This begins in 1853. The war is really between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, and it has to do with allowing the access for the Russians through these canals into the Mediterranean Sea, and the fight is over Crimea, which is right up in here. So the Turks request the assistance of the French and the British to battle the Russians in this war, and the British agree under a certain condition. Amazing that they say this, especially if you think about it in the modern era. They say to the Turks, okay, we will back you, we'll be your allies in this war if, following the war, you allow Jews to settle in Palestine within the Ottoman Empire. I mean, it's like that. In other words, there's no good reason politically. There's no strategic reason why the British would ever ask such a thing. Why do such a thing? But it's because the British government is now so Christianized. Now it's so influenced by the teachings of the Bible and the earlier teachings of the Puritans that they simply are following what the Scriptures say and simply orchestrating political events to fulfill biblical prophecy. I mean, it's really remarkable. And so what happens in the war is, sure enough, the Turks win the war with the help of the British and the French. And following the war, there's the Paris Treaty of 1858, which gives Jews rights with Christians in the Ottoman Empire and the right for Jews to settle in Palestine. And with that, begin the first of the agricultural settlements that begin to move to Palestine in the late 1850s and 1860s, funded by Baron Rothschild in England, and thus begin the very beginnings of the Aliyah movement. The Aliyahs hadn't really begun, but this is the very formative stage, and it all came from the push of these British Christians to do such a thing. The next event that happens in 1861, there is another book that's written in England called The Restoration of the Jews, The History, Principles, and Bearings on the Question. This was written by a theologian by the name of David Brown, and what he tries to show is that the Scriptures should be interpreted literally and not allegorically. And he uses archaeology to prove his case that the Bible can be relied upon, and that the Scriptures, that we should really follow the Scriptures in all that we do. Now, what's so valuable about that? Well, a number of things had been happening historically in the last 100 years or so. First of all, one of the big things that happened is that the seminaries had been invaded by higher criticism, challenging the authenticity and veracity of the Scriptures, saying that they're really myths, that they're evolution of mankind's thoughts, and that they really have no real, they're not historical. In other words, and they certainly have no real value as far as any kind of prophetic value. And so it challenges the underpinnings of the Scriptures. Right around at the same time were the beginnings of the writings of Darwin and Aldous Huxley. Charles Darwin writes in his Origin of Species, Aldous Huxley in his book Man's Place in Nature, and Darwin's later in The Descent of Man, where they basically attack the biblical foundation of society, put forth a completely naturalistic, materialistic orientation towards society, that mankind that mankind is not a creation of God, but is simply an evolved form of nature. And so consequently, and this became very popular, of course, as we know, in the Western world, and became a challenge in British thinking as they began to adopt this thinking. Well, what's the significance of David Brown's book? Well, here's the key. Because if the British buy into a more naturalistic perspective on humanity, then why are they going to follow the biblical prophecies and try to get the Jews back to the promised land? Again, there's no good strategic reason to bring the Jews back to the land of Israel. In fact, it just causes political problems. But if there's a spiritual reason for doing so, then it makes complete sense. David Brown's book, where he uses theology, archaeology, and science to prove the Bible's authenticity, becomes persuasive in British intellectual society and becomes the prevailing views of the British intellectuals that, yes, we're on course here, following what the Bible says and believing the Bible as being God's Word. And so it preserves God's intentions going through Britain during this time. Another amazing thing happening. Then we have, in the 1860s, we have the writings of by George Eliot, a book called Daniel Deronda, which is a novel. The novel is about the struggle of a Jewish person to maintain, to retain their own identity. And so George Eliot propounds the idea that this Jewish person should go back to Israel, and that Israel should become a nation of vision for the Jewish people. And she specifically addresses this book to the Jews. Now, all these other books that have been written, they weren't read by Jews. These were read by the Christians, British government leaders, or Christian Zionists, so forth. The Jews didn't read any of these things, these theological books. They're not interested in them. They're often doing their own thing. But Daniel Deronda is translated into Yiddish and Russian, and it's read by a Jewish person in Russia whose name was Yehuda Perlman. Yehuda Perlman becomes convinced that this is true, that's what she says, and becomes an avid Zionist, later changes his name to Eliezer ben, I can't think of the guy's name, Eliezer ben Yehuda, the father of the Hebrew language, and becomes one of the major Zionists of the modern era, and again becomes the father of the Hebrew language, the modern Hebrew language, and transforms Hebrew from an unspoken ancient language into a modern spoken language in Israel. Another amazing thing. And then finally, really along this line of that we're taking here is the writings of Benjamin Disraeli. Disraeli becomes the prime minister, as we said, and in 1877 he writes an article that's called this. It's called "The Jewish Question is the Oriental Quest." What he does in this book is he says the following. I'm quoting from Disraeli's writings. He says this. He predicts that within 50 years, a nation of 1 million Jews will live in Israel under the guidance of the British. You know what? He was completely on the mark. I mean, there were hardly any Jews. In 1877, the Aliyah movements had not begun. And yet he's saying in 50 years, there will be 1 million Jews in Israel living under the British rule. He was almost exactly on point. What actually happened 50 years later, which takes it into the late 1920s, is you have 500,000 to 750,000 Jews living in the land of Israel under British control. It was a prophetic statement written again by a Messianic Jew, Benjamin Disraeli, the prime minister of England. And so, as we conclude this session, the point that I'm trying to make here is this, is that God was using over a 200 to 300 year period, the British Christians to lay the foundation for Zionism. None of the Jews, or very few of the Jews, had gone back. The Aliyah movements had not started yet. And so the British, through treatises, through papers, through political action, through articles, had persuaded the British society, had helped to change the world, and now we're laying the foundation for the Jewish people to ultimately go back, and now are prophesying almost exactly what is going to happen into the foreseeable future. It's an amazing story. It's one of the great untold stories, and we will see in the next session really the outgrowth of what actually happens as the Jewish people capture this vision and begin to run with it and bring about the modern Zionist movement, a remarkable and great story.